Why should we care about having true beliefs? And why do demonstrably false beliefs persist and spread without apparent consequence for the people who hold them? It might seem that there's an obvious reason that true beliefs matter and false beliefs will hurt you. But if that's right, then why is it irrelevant to many people whether they believe true things or not? In an age driven by factual disputes over everything from climate change to the size of inauguration crowds, Cailin O'Connor argues that social factors, not individual psychology, are what's essential to understanding the persistence of false belief, and that we must know how these social forces work in order to fight misinformation effectively. Cailin O'Connor is a philosopher of biology and behavioral sciences, philosopher of science, and evolutionary game theorist. Professor O'Connor teaches in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science and is a member of the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Science at UC Irvine. Professor O'Connor is currently co-administering an NSF grant, Consensus Democracy and the Public Understanding of Science, with James Owen Weatherall, her co-author for the trade book, The Misinformation Age, which was published with the Yale University Press. Professor O'Connor has two other prominent publications, including The Origins of Unfairness, published in July 2019, and The Games and the Philosophy of Biology, published just in 2020. Professor O'Connor's presentation is co-sponsored by the Open Academy at CMC. Professor O'Connor will present for 20 minutes before jumping into conversation with me and Chris. Using the Q&A function, we'll accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college: student, faculty, parent, alumni, or friend of the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor O'Connor to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here speaking today, especially in a series with so many esteemed speakers. Let me just share my slides. All right, there we go. So I hope that today we can talk about a lot of different topics related to false belief and misinformation, especially during the pandemic. But to get us started, I thought I would present on one specific topic regarding polarization and hydroxychloroquine. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So to give a little background on who I am and what my work here looks like, in 2019, I published this book with James Weatherall. So Jim is a colleague of mine. We're both at UC Irvine in philosophy. Jim's also my husband, so I did write a book with my husband, which is a little weird. But what we do in this book is use historical cases and then also mathematical models and simulation to study the propagation and spread of false belief. So one thing we look at in particular are what are called network models. So these are computer simulations that represent groups of people and social ties between them and look at how beliefs can spread through these social ties. And then you use them to try to learn more about how beliefs spread in real life groups. So using this kind of method, we study both what you might call endogenous and exogenous drivers of false belief and polarization. We look at a lot of topics, but when I'm talking about endogenous factors, I mean things that are kind of inherent to humans and human society. So we look at things like, who do we trust and why do we trust them, and how does that drive the things we come to believe? We look at things like homophily, the tendency that many people show to trust and connect with others who they take to be part of their in-group. We look at conformity, or tendencies of people to want to stick in, to not stick out of the crowd, to share beliefs and behaviors with other people. And then we also look at these more exogenous factors, so things that have to do with features regarding what kinds of information gets shared and with whom. So things like industrial propaganda and political propaganda. We also look at media practices to consider how these practices influence what information we all see and why. So that's a little background. In the book, we talk a good amount about misinformation and disinformation. And when we talk about these things, by now, probably most of us are familiar with some of the features of these phenomena. So just to pull apart what people are usually talking about when they're talking about misinformation versus disinformation. Misinformation is often understood to be misleading content where there isn't an intent to mislead. So it's often content that's readily refuted at the time of production. So information where someone might start sharing some idea or claim, and other people know at that time that in fact it's false, but it still gets some traction and starts to spread socially. Misinformation often involves things like unfounded rumors that spread on the internet, speculation. Misinformation sometimes involves conspiracy theories, these more elaborate theories that are usually not true about how things work in the world. Errors often play a role in misinformation, especially errors propagated socially. So someone says something that turns out not to be right. They're not trying to mislead, but then it starts spreading. Disinformation, on the other hand, is usually understood as misleading content that's intended to deceive. So content designed to manipulate or mislead people. Sometimes disinformation is intended to control public belief. Other times it can be intended or shaped to create polarization. So these are the usual suspects, and goodness knows, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been seeing a whole lot of this stuff. So I'm just going to run through a couple examples, though this will in no way sort of capture the scope of misinformation and disinformation online during the pandemic. So if you were on the internet last spring, you might have seen this little rumor that if you could hold your breath for 10 seconds, that would tell you whether you have coronavirus. You couldn't have COVID and also hold your breath for 10 seconds. Of course, this is false, but it's a rumor that was widely spread through social networks. In Iran this last spring, there were very widespread rumors that drinking alcohol could cure COVID-19. Of course, this is also false, but it led a number of people to consume unsafe alcohol. And as of April of this year, it was estimated that several hundred people had died this way. Here's another piece of misinformation along those lines, though less widespread. In the US, that maybe drinking disinfectant might prevent COVID-19, and several people in fact did this. There have been a number of conspiracy theories about COVID-19 that have popped up. So for example, the theory that 5G cell phone towers are related to the spread of COVID. This conspiracy theory actually led people to attack cell phone towers. And there have been other widespread conspiracies about the origins of the virus, especially that it was intended as a bioweapon and then was accidentally loosed. There's been disinformation surrounding COVID. So a number of states have taken this as an opportunity to try to foster bad feelings towards perceived enemies of state by implying that other countries were responsible for either the creation or the spread of COVID. There's the Plandemic conspiracy video. I have not actually watched this, but it's yet another example of misinformation or disinformation surrounding the pandemic. So this has been, it's been so widespread that the WHO, beside announcing a pandemic, has also announced that there's an infodemic. So a correlating problem on the internet where there's a huge amount of misinformation and misunderstanding regarding the workings of COVID. So we have all these usual suspects at play, but today I actually want to talk about something else which doesn't exactly fit the normal misinformation, disinformation pattern. So I want to talk about a social process by which people end up with false beliefs during the pandemic, but also not during the pandemic. It strictly speaking doesn't involve misinformation or disinformation, and instead depends on trust dynamics between people. So kind of a way that we can end up with false beliefs even outside of the well understood factors that I've been discussing so far. And I want to talk about this kind of process using a specific example, the example of hydroxychloroquine and related beliefs about hydroxychloroquine in the US. So I'm going to first walk through the recent history of beliefs about this drug. So earlier this year, a study was published by a Chinese research group that looked at a number of antiviral drugs and found that some of them seemed to inhibit coronavirus in vitro, so outside the human body in test tubes, basically. These included both remdesivir, that's actually what President Trump has been treated with for the last few days, and also chloroquine, a long-used antiviral, especially for malaria. As the pandemic began to heat up, many doctors, both on the basis of this study, but also on their general knowledge about antiviral drugs, began to prescribe these drugs, and especially chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, which is a newer, safer relative of chloroquine, to treat COVID. So here's a figure showing physicians who used hydroxychloroquine to treat a patient diagnosed with COVID-19. This is showing data from late March and early April. And as you can see, across a number of countries and regions, there's really a pretty significant number of doctors who are prescribing this. In Italy, 83%. Even in the UK, which is the country listed here with the lowest percentage, 1/10 of doctors had prescribed hydroxychloroquine to a patient. So doctors are using this because it looks like possibly a promising treatment. At the same time, something was happening online. So in early mid-March, a Twitter user living in China posted this tweet about chloroquine. Chloroquine will keep most people out of the hospital. The US hasn't learned about that yet. And they tweeted this at James Todaro, who is a blockchain investor and also has an MD. Then a few days later, Todaro posted about chloroquine. There is growing evidence of chloroquine as a highly effective treatment for COVID-19, and then posts a link to a document which he had created with 2 other collaborators, one of whom was a lawyer named Gregory Regano, and the document compiled a bunch of evidence that chloroquine might be an effective COVID treatment. Then a few days later, Elon Musk, who of course is very famous, has a huge Twitter following, posted linking this document and says maybe worth considering chloroquine for COVID-19, and follows up that same day saying hydroxychloroquine is probably better. Shortly after Elon Musk tweets this, and this idea is starting to gain traction on Twitter, the Tucker Carlson show on Fox News has Gregory Regano, so one of the authors of this document, on to talk about hydroxychloroquine. And then that same day, President Trump announced that hydroxychloroquine was looking like a promising drug treatment for COVID-19. And then in the following weeks, President Trump continued boosting hydroxychloroquine as a possible miracle drug or a really successful treatment, often without the evidence really being there to vet and support these claims about its efficacy. Now, following this statement by Trump and his boosterism of the drug, a further curious thing happened, which is that hydroxychloroquine and beliefs about its effectiveness became a locus for disagreement and anger in the US public. And in particular, beliefs about whether it worked well became highly polarized. So here's 2 examples of tweets about it. Attention, Trump deranged Democrat governors, preventing doctors from saving lives, to drive up the death rate because you think it hurts. So here's someone who's accusing Democrats of trying to get rid of hydroxychloroquine to make the death rate higher because that would look bad for Trump. And here's someone who's saying that hydroxychloroquine is all hype, hyped by a charlatan, this French doctor, Didier Rao, who's playing fast and loose with the facts. So we see polarization happening. Okay, so when we're talking about polarization, what exactly are we talking about here? This word usually refers to situations where you have subgroups in a society who are holding stable and mutually exclusive beliefs, even in the face of debate and discussion. So here we had a situation where suddenly liberals were very skeptical about hydroxychloroquine. And this was even though it had some promising results supporting it and many doctors using it. Conservatives, on the other hand, became very enthusiastic about hydroxychloroquine, and this was even though it had not been conclusively shown to help with COVID at all, and subsequently it has been shown to not be an effective treatment for COVID. So notice that beliefs about this became polarized. Based on the evidence at that point, this last spring and early summer, you should probably hold a belief like, this might be a promising treatment. We'll have to wait and see whether that turns out to be the case. But in fact, we see these much more divisive beliefs about it. Now, there's another thing to note about the way this became polarized. It didn't just become willy-nilly polarized where some people thought it was great and other people thought it was not, and there was no pattern to that. It became polarized along political party lines. So in the US, the same people who would be likely to tell you that guns are dangerous also became the same people likely to scorn the use of hydroxychloroquine. The people who might say that evolutionary theory is a hoax also became likely to promote hydroxychloroquine. So in other words, this belief became part of our existing belief factions. And what I mean by that, by a belief faction, are groups in which actors hold multiple shared polarized beliefs. And these are usually groups that are breaking along political fault lines. So we got interested in belief factions, and especially in this case, and tried to start looking at how people explain this fact that on the face of it seems rather odd, that you have polarization happening not just about individual beliefs, but about many beliefs, so that one person starts to hold a bunch of shared beliefs within their in-group, and out-groups start to hold a bunch of other shared beliefs. Now, this has been explained in previous work by appeal to shared ideology. And the idea here is that people have different commitments to ideology, which makes them more likely to hold or not hold certain beliefs. And then this ideology explains why you see clusters of beliefs in different groups. So for example, George Lakoff very influentially claims that in the US, conservatives hold to what he calls a strict father model of government, and liberals to what he calls a nurturant parent model of government. And he says this, the role of government, social programs, taxation, education, the environment, energy, gun control, abortion, the death penalty, and so on, are ultimately not different issues, but manifestations of a single issue, strictness versus nurturance. So this is supposed to be a situation where strict father ideology leads to a bunch of different beliefs that are all the same for one group. Nurturant parent ideology leads to a bunch of beliefs that are all the same for another group. And there are different versions of what we might call these common cause explanations for belief factions. So, for example, some people have argued, I don't think very persuasively, that there are genetic differences underlying whether you become a conservative or a liberal, and it's these genes that then lead conservatives to share clusters of beliefs versus liberals to share clusters of beliefs. So these common cause explanations are the kind of dominant explanation for these sorts of factions. But there's something weird going on here, which is that there isn't a very clear ideological connection between thinking something like hydroxychloroquine treats COVID to other issues connected with conservatism and liberalism in the US. Do strict fathers prefer hydroxychloroquine? I think what especially drives this home is that there was kind of a period of time where hydroxychloroquine became the favored drug of the right, whereas remdesivir became the favored drug of the left. That's the other antiviral mentioned earlier in this study out of China. And so it doesn't seem on the face of it like there are really ideological reasons why one group or the other would adopt one of these. It seems more to do with some kind of accident of history. So before all of this happened, Jim and I, in support of our book, had written this paper called Endogenous Epistemic Factionalization, because of course, as academics, we like to use big words in our paper titles. But what we do in there is look at these kinds of belief factions and try to ask whether they can form on their own, absent ideology, as a result of trust dynamics. So what we do in that paper is build a model to try to understand this sort of process and whether that can happen. Now, a lot of researchers have used models to explore polarization, and across all these models are features of the following sort. Similarity of belief and opinion determines level of social influence. And when you have that kind of feature, you can have these feedback loops where if you and I start to diverge in our beliefs, we start to influence each other less and less, which means we can become part of two groups where we're holding mutually exclusive beliefs and we're not influencing each other anymore. So polarization can become stable. Now in our paper, what we did was build a kind of polarization model. We tuned this model specifically to scientific beliefs and scientific communities. So beliefs like hydroxychloroquine is or isn't an effective treatment for COVID-19, rather than beliefs like it's morally wrong to own a gun or something like that. So beliefs about matters of fact. And in our model, we assumed, again, like these other polarization models, that agents use similarity across belief to determine how much to trust information shared by others. So if I'm looking at you, I ask, how much do we have in common as far as our beliefs go before I decide whether I'm going to trust or uptake information you're sharing with me? And in particular, I look across a number of different beliefs in deciding how similar we are and how much I ought to trust you. So I look not just at your beliefs in one arena, but in multiple arenas. And then we ask, when people determine their trust of others in this way, can we get these factions to just emerge endogenously as a result of these social trust dynamics? I won't bury the lead. We do, in fact, find that. So to try to give some idea of why that happens, I made this little figure to show something about how our models work. So this is a representation of a social network where each one of these nodes represents an individual, and then these connections between them or edges in the network are social connections. So connections where you might share information, and also you're going to have some level of trust. And we can look at situations like this one where we already have some polarized beliefs in the group. So here we use color to represent beliefs. So maybe these folks have one kind of belief about guns and these folks have another kind of belief about guns. So that's starting us off in a situation where folks with red beliefs are going to trust information from each other more than they will trust information from folks with yellow beliefs, and same for the yellow group. All right, so suppose there's some new idea. I'm going to represent this by overlaying blue circles, like maybe hydroxychloroquine might work as a treatment for COVID. Now, at the beginning of this kind of social process, some people might adopt this belief, and it might be fairly random, not tied into these previous beliefs. So maybe some people just happen to hear about this on the internet and start to think, well, maybe that could be useful, maybe it could work. And then what you sort of expect to happen, given the way people learn from each other, is that people will start to share information with those in their network about this new belief. So they'll start to give them evidence and information. And so this new belief might start to spread. So maybe more people start to hear about hydroxychloroquine and think that maybe it's promising. But remember, we have this trust dynamic where now some people are hearing that the others they don't trust have adopted this belief. And in the meantime, the people they do trust maybe haven't. And so they become more likely to drop the belief. And we show that without representing anything regarding ideology or leanings toward one belief or another, you can end up with these situations where only one of the groups has adopted this new belief and the other hasn't. And it entirely had to do with who they trusted in the first place and who they didn't trust. So it's important to recognize in a case like this, the details of the belief don't really matter. It's the personal connections and the underlying trust that matter to who believes what. Now, of course, this isn't the only example of polarization during the pandemic. Recent studies have shown the US is polarized over a number of issues, including how much they approve of the administration's response to the pandemic, the severity and threat of COVID-19, things like school policy, whether schools should be virtual or go back in person, the efficacy and importance of social distancing, whether we should have mask mandates and whether masking is important. And in fact, just a few days ago during the presidential debate, we saw a demonstration of this last one where Donald Trump said to Joe Biden, "I don't wear face masks like him. Every time you see him, he's got a mask. He could be speaking 200 feet away. He shows up with the biggest mask I've ever seen." So that is, again, a kind of representation of another example of polarization during the pandemic. And I should note these models don't apply just to the pandemic. In fact, we see belief factions formed over many different sorts of beliefs. And when we first developed the models, we were trying to explain these other pre-existing examples where we thought there's polarization, but it doesn't seem like there's really a good ideological reason for particular beliefs to be combined on one side or the other. All right, so I'm going to wrap up in a sec, but I just wanted to give a few important takeaways. So first, in cases where no one's actively spreading misinformation or disinformation, we can see a group of people nonetheless ending up misinformed because of belief factionalizations. So without these kinds of factions, there's a good chance that everybody can learn the true thing. But because we had this mistrust in society, it creates a situation where one whole group of people might now be misinformed as a result. Second, we don't need to appeal to underlying ideology in every case to explain these kinds of factions. Now, we think, of course, ideology can play a role in some cases, but not in all of them. Third, when polarizing figures like Donald Trump or other left politicians who are polarizing promote specific scientific claims, especially if they do this without proper vetting, they run the risk of polarizing these claims. So by dint of themselves being polarizing figures, when they weigh in on scientific beliefs, this can cause problems because we already have this polarized structure in our society. Last, we think that hydroxychloroquine could have been some other drug. It could have been remdesivir. There wasn't anything special about it that made it end up being the kind of right-wing treatment for this last period, though now, of course, that has died out as it became more clear that it is not a good treatment. All right, and with that, I will finish the slides, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that interesting talk. I guess that very last point you made was really interesting to me. How it could have been rem, rem how you pronounce that?
Remdesivir.
Remdesivir or hydro, the other one.
You can say R and H if you want. They're definitely long drug names.
Yeah. So I guess what if that's I guess like what makes it different, or kind of what's different if it's not necessarily misinformation that's being spread? What kind of does it mean that misinformation will be spread on the other side because of this polarization, or is it just like a completely different outcome?
Well, I think the main idea here is that when you have this kind of polarization and mistrust, it sets you up in a scenario where a lot of times you're going to have some, beliefs out there. And because of this mistrust between groups, one group is going to settle on the correct belief, and then the other on an incorrect belief, and a whole group of people is going to be stabilized into holding this incorrect belief because of these in-group out-group dynamics. Whereas if you didn't have these kind of polarization effects, you don't on the face of it expect to see so much misunderstanding or false belief in a situation like this.
So my question kind of goes back to the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. So I'm interested in knowing why this distinction is important and if we should treat both concepts differently or if we should treat them the same given that disinformation has this intention behind it.
Yeah, I think that so it's kind of traditional for people to draw this distinction as if it's a really clear distinction. In fact, if you look at the breadth and weirdness of online propaganda and misleading content, there's so much of it. It takes all these different forms. A lot of them really blur the line actually between misinformation and disinformation. Especially there's a lot of content that's created by someone who is a disinformant, but is intended to go viral so that all the people actually sharing it, in fact, believe it. So they don't have any intention to mislead. And cases like that, I think, really blur the distinction. But that said, it sometimes is important to have these terms to understand the difference so that you can talk about, for example, the most extreme cases where there really are people out there who are trying to mislead people, who are playing an active role in misleading others, and where this might be an ideal target for regulation regarding disinformation or attention from, say, groups like Twitter and Facebook, and trying to reduce the amount of disinformation out there. So sometimes that distinction, I think, is useful for things like that.
So do you believe that American political polarization with respect to coronavirus response was inevitable in its current formation, given like the pre-existing polarization?
Sorry, the sound was going out a little bit. Do I think it was inevitable in this particular domain? Was that the question?
Yeah, so do you think that polarization over coronavirus was inevitable given like the pre-existing polarization?
No, I don't think so, actually. So I think if you look at like when new beliefs and possibilities start emerging, a lot of them, probably most of them, do not end up being polarized. Most of the time, public belief kind of mostly tracks scientific belief and the guidance of experts, and most people come to the most likely true beliefs as a result of it. It's only in some special cases where you see polarization emerge. So I think in this case, if there hadn't been these very high profile figures who started supporting hydroxychloroquine on the right, and then some high profile figures on the left who said, well, wait, this is nonsense, there's not enough evidence. They were right that there wasn't enough evidence, but the response probably went too far to like, well, this is a hoax, or it's ridiculous to ever think that this could work. So if you hadn't had that series of events, I don't see any reason why beliefs about this drug would have become polarized in the US.
So I wanted to go back to your conversation on trust dynamics and how we have feedback loops with people who have similar beliefs than us. So how do you think the pandemic has affected trust dynamics and the ways in which our networks are formed and maintained?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about that. I mean, if I'm granted leave to just wildly speculate a little bit, I'm guessing that physical distancing means that people are spending more time online and probably engaging in online social connection more than they would have been before the pandemic. And that might in some way shift some of these dynamics about who you're spending time with, who you trust, who's part of your in-group. But without doing actual research on it, it would be pretty hard to know just what is happening.
Um, So, kind of going off of or continuing on this idea of trust, I'm wondering how might social media like fortify or weaken this trust that we have? Um, are people more prone to adopt the beliefs of someone they don't know personally because of social media, but like they may be familiar with their opinions online?
Yeah, so when we think about the advent of social media and these trust dynamics, it's done a few things. So one thing it does is allow people to connect with others who aren't in their immediate vicinity, and especially to find others who hold their same beliefs, right? So if you are mostly interacting with people who are physically near to you, the chances that you can find people who share your same beliefs in some, if you have kind of extreme or unlikely or really out there beliefs, is pretty low. But if you can go onto social media and maybe you are a conspiracy theorist or flat earther or whatever, you can find other people who share those beliefs, right? And so in doing that, you can create an in-group where you're trusting information from these other people, they're trusting information from you. Maybe your beliefs might become more extreme as an example, as a result of this, and you start to form a polarized group that isn't trusting information from the mainstream. So I think that's one of the things about social media, the way it allows people to seek out new in-groups, that has changed.
I think on the topic of social media, do you think that social media platforms have an obligation to um, mitigate the spread of misinformation on their platforms?
Yeah, I do think they have this obligation. Of course, in discussing this kind of issue, suppressing misinformation and disinformation, free speech norms have to be protected at the same time. And there is a good amount of real tension there. At the same time, I like to think of social media using an analogy to environmentalism, where we can want clean informational environments in the same way we want clean natural environments. We can want an environment that's generally healthy for us and our beliefs, where most of the stuff we're seeing is accurate, not misleading, is going to give us good information, allow us to function well, allow us to make good choices for our lives. And so there's such a benefit to us in having that. I think that as long as they can do it within the realm where they're protecting free speech, all social media platforms should in fact be promoting these clean information environments. And there's a lot of ways to go about this. You don't have to take down every post that could be false, but you can put a filter over it that says this contains misleading information. Like, click at your own risk, read at your own risk. You can also not promote it using your algorithm. So YouTube, for example, has been called on recently not to promote conspiracy videos, which were being very widely promoted using its algorithms because they're attractive and interesting. So we can expect those kinds of steps from social media platforms.
Yeah, so kind of going off of the responsibilities of social media platforms, if um, someone comes across a piece of media that kind of has this filter that says this is misinformation, click at your own risk, and they still click, do you think that they that person will actually kind of believe it is misinformation or continue to kind of confirm those pre-existing beliefs that they already had?
I think it really tends to depend on what kind of belief we're talking about and what situation that person is in. So it certainly seems to be the situation that certain people end up in certain belief states that are very hard to change, right? And they're hard to change by telling them that they're hearing misinformation or by just giving good information, because these people are really entrenched in these beliefs. Often they're already polarized in society, and so they think, well, there's another side trying to convince me of this, but I don't trust them. So there could be situations and beliefs where people see a filter like that and think like, well, this is the media elites trying to keep me from opening my eyes and trying to keep everyone sheeple or whatever, and not trust it. But I think generally, on the balance, these things are very helpful in giving most people at least some indication, okay, this information I'm about to see is recognized by experts as misleading.
You kind of touched on this, but you mentioned that those who are misinformed, they're very deeply connected to their ideas. So, how do we handle these types of situations where we're talking to people who are misinformed and they um, are not budging from their misinformation?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of cases. Sometimes people hold false beliefs and they're not particularly important to them and they might be transient. You know, maybe they just heard it somewhere and then they hear, oh, that's not right, and they let go of that belief. The example I like to give is that until very recently, I believe the thing I had heard as a kid, which is that daddy longlegs, these like long-legged spiders with tiny bodies, were the most poisonous spiders in the world. And then I was in an interview about misinformation where the host was like, here's an example of an unfounded rumor. And I was like, ah, yes, I probably should have stopped believing that before now. So, and then I just let go of that belief, right? So sometimes there are those cases. You're talking about these other cases where people have really entrenched in a belief. It becomes almost part of a value for them. It might become a signal of their membership in some group, right? It might become a signal that they're a liberal or a conservative or a Christian or whatever. Um, that gets much trickier. You can't necessarily easily fix these kinds of false beliefs and misunderstandings in these cases. One thing that's a promising approach is to try to build trust with people who hold false beliefs through shared experience or shared identity, whatever that may be. So, for example, if you can connect with someone and say, I see all the reasons you might hold this false belief, I really do understand why you would get there. Here's why I have gone a different route and my pathway to this different belief, that's maybe a good approach. Also, if we think from a kind of societal intervention standpoint, it's good to use people who are trusted to communicate with certain groups. So, for example, there are a lot of vaccine denialists in Southern California. There are also vaccine denialists in the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. But I would want to use different people to communicate with these two groups. You know, I'd want maybe a rabbi to talk to people in Brooklyn and maybe Gwyneth Paltrow to talk to these new aging moms in Southern California. Someone who can share some kind of trust or connection with the people they're talking with.
Yeah, so that I guess I kind of want to know more about this connection between the nurturing parent idea and like liberal ideology. I think that oftentimes, like there's kind of such a strong dislike and distaste for Trump, that kind of whatever Trump says will be kind of seen as like the wrong thing by like liberals. So I'm wondering if like you can, if that, how that connects to the nurturing parent idea, or if it does at all. Um, Kind of just like this stark opposition.
Yeah, I don't know that it necessarily connects to the nurturing parent idea, though, you know, Trump might fall into the vote, you know, if Lakoff were describing him as a politician, he might fall under that kind of strict father model. I'm not sure enough about that position to analyze it. But I do think you were right about this thing where we have a situation where anything he says, basically, people on the other side of the political divide are going to mistrust and maybe even try to go in the other direction just because he said it. You know, it's not that every single policy he ever made was bad. It's not that every single thing he's ever said was false or a lie. And yet you do see people behaving that way sometimes, I think, because of this extreme polarization and trust dynamics.
So we're now going to transition into some audience questions. So the first one is from a student. Is it ever acceptable to knowingly share misinformation or disinformation, such as the WHO's claim early in the pandemic that civilians wearing masks doesn't help, so that masks would be saved for frontline health workers?
Yeah, so I think this claim by WHO, you know, I don't necessarily think they were trying to spread misinformation at that point. Maybe I'm confused about that example, but my understanding is that earlier in the pandemic, it really was the medical opinion that masks weren't that necessary and weren't going to do that much for transmission for everyday people. Um, Now, that said, in a case like this, where people were trying to spread misinformation for what they think of as the greater good or something, uh, is that acceptable? I have no idea. I think it depends on your ethical position regarding whether it's okay to do things that themselves are bad or could be harmful, with the idea that someday maybe there will be a benefit to that behavior. But that is just like the hugest philosophical question that I am in no way uh, competent to comment on.
All right. So our next question from a student asks, you may be familiar with the Netflix documentary film, The Social Dilemma, that exposed the ways that social media giants utilize big data and very precise algorithms to keep you engaged in things you're already interested in, believe in. Essentially, the digital world we live in is or can be an echo chamber. So how do we break out of it and encourage others to step out of these bubbles as well?
Yeah, this is really difficult because, of course, what social media companies are doing is responding to what people want, what keeps them engaged, right? What we are, in fact, seeking when we go onto social media. But it's been noticed that what we're seeking are not usually viewpoints that contradict our own or force us to open up our mind a little bit, but rather viewpoints that echo ours very well. I mean, what we can do is try to pressure social media companies to not use these kinds of algorithms. We can try to pressure them to shape algorithms not just to capture our attention, but maybe to benefit our belief states and to benefit the functioning of our democracy. And if users put pressure on social media companies to do this, hopefully they try to create products that aren't just about pleasing us, but are also allowing us to act in our own best interest democratically.
The next question is from a staff member, and they're curious in knowing if you were able to draw any parallels between your findings on misinformation slash disinformation and populist movements.
This wasn't something that I've really worked on, though I know that a lot of political scientists have thought about this, like how especially populist leaders sometimes use misinformation or various propaganda techniques to try to influence the public or their citizens or whoever, but it's rather outside my expertise.
Thank you. We have a question from Alon who asks, it seems like our country has never been as polarized politically as it is today. What have been the primary causes, and I guess what can be done to address this problem?
Oh man. It's so, as far as what, why suddenly are things seeming so polarized? There are probably a number of things that have mattered and contributed to this. These very widespread, complex cultural phenomena like this never have a very simple cause. Some of the things that people think may have played a role in this are changes in our media. So first, changes in that we went from essentially a nonpartisan news model to a partisan news model, which seems to have driven some polarization. But then also, especially the change to social media and people getting most of their news through social media channels is possibly playing a role in this polarization. Some of the things we've talked about, like echo chambers, where you choose who you're going to connect to and what news you're going to get, probably play a role here. Also, algorithms that give you information that you most like or enjoy or like to click on probably play a role here. And in addition, there's increasing evidence that members of, for example, the Russian government have tried to drive polarization in the US, so have taken active measures to make us more polarized, more divided, more angry, like more dysfunctional. It's hard to say hypothetically, it's hard to say how effective that has been. In a hypothetical world where they weren't working, would we be this polarized? It's really hard to know, but that might be playing a role too. Oh, and what can we do? I don't know. Improving our media structures would certainly be a good step.
So the next question is from a student as well. If President Trump had responded strongly in March and advocated long-term shutdowns, might Democrats have adopted the opposite position reflexively, like they did for hydroxychloroquine, and perhaps said that Trump was overreacting, motivated by anti-Chinese racism?
Oh, that's really interesting. So again, it's so hard to know with these complicated scenarios what could happen if we ran things differently. But okay, the suggestion is that what if Trump had taken the position of COVID is really serious and we really need to shut things down? Would it then have been the case that a bunch of liberals would have reflexively uh, tried to downplay the seriousness of COVID and argued like, no, we need to go back in person to schools or not shut down the economy? I don't know. It seems entirely possible, especially when we have this conflictual model for democracy where one party is going to win and the other party is going to lose. It's often in the interests of one party to portray whatever the decisions or policies of the other party as nonsensical or not successful.
I have a follow-up question to the question I asked before Nandini asked. I was wondering if there are trends of kind of greater intrastate polarization in other nations, or if this issue is like uniquely American, and you may not have the answer for that. I was just wondering.
My understanding, though I'm not a huge expert on this topic, is that there are some countries where you see pretty serious polarization. So I think Brazil is a good example where people's feelings about Bolsonaro, their president, are really extreme. Some people love him, some people just absolutely hate him. Of course, there are a lot of countries where we don't see this kind of really intense polarization emerging.
So, going back to the concept on trust dynamics, in a pre social media world, how are these dynamics maintained and how have they evolved?
In a pre-social media world, how, sorry,
Like,
how, oh,
sorry,
can you say it one more time?
no worries. So, in a world before social media has kind of taken over the way we form our networks, how was trust maintained?
Yeah, so a lot of what determines who we trust, uh, there are a whole bunch of different features. So when you are told someone by somebody else, you have this moment where they've given you a claim, a rumor, an idea, whatever. You have to decide, are you going to believe it or not believe it? Or to what degree are you going to kind of take this on? And in that moment, your brain does a lot of different things. It looks at how plausible this idea is, but also who the person is sharing the idea with you. Now, when you consider this other person, there are a lot of things that seem to play a role in whether people trust them or not. So some things are really reasonable things from a knowledge point of view, like are they an expert in this kind of knowledge? Have they told me true things before in this sort of scenario? Other things include things like prestige bias. Are they prestigious and well respected? Do other people like them? But then there are also these in-group biases, like do they share my social identity? Are they my same gender or race? Are they from the same country as me? Were they part of my football club growing up? These things also seem to play a role. And so, and along those lines, this feature, which I talked about in the talk and the models, do they share my beliefs, also is one of these things that plays a really important role in determining who you trust and who you believe. Now, pre-social media, all of those things were at play, just like they are now. It's just that some of the dynamics of who we get connected to and what we see from them, et cetera, have changed on social media.
All right, thank you. And we have a question from an alum asking, do you recommend any further reading on this subject?
Oh, there's lots of good stuff to read if you're interested in misinformation, disinformation. I really recommend the work of Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West, who are professors at University of Washington. So they have this project called Calling Bullshit, where they had a class and Now they have a book. So our book really focuses on social connections and the role of social connection in belief. They focus a lot on information literacy. So how can you as an individual learn to see bullshit, basically, and become a better detector of nonsense? So that's really good. There have been several books recently, like, now I can't remember the name of it, but this book by Kathleen Jamieson, who looked at interstate propaganda during like 2016, which was really interesting. There have been some books on network propaganda. So there really is a lot out there if you want to do more research.
Before we conclude our event, do you have any parting thoughts for our audience?
Well, maybe I'll just extend this environmentalism metaphor a little more. I really like this idea that, like, when we're thinking about our information environments, they're never going to be perfect. It's part of the human condition that there are rumors and false beliefs propagating. So really what we're trying to do is just get them as clean as we can, to put ourselves in situations where we're set up to encounter and then pick up true beliefs rather than false ones. And so in the same way that environmentalism is in the 70s led to a bunch of norm changes and legislation changes that said norms like you shouldn't litter, and legislation that said, well, you can no longer emit certain kinds of pollutants. We should be thinking that way about misinformation and disinformation and misleading content. Like, it's our responsibility as individuals to develop new norms and practices that mean we share less of this stuff. We protect others from misinformation and disinformation. We should be putting pressure on social media platforms. These platforms should be doing what they can to clean up our informational environments. The government should be playing a role in researching misinformation and disinformation, and also thinking about whether there's legislation that's appropriate to protect us from it, but also preserves free speech norms. The traditional media should be thinking, what can we do about it? So we should be thinking about a kind of widespread societal response, because it really is something that harms us all. We need our democracy to function well for us all to have good lives, right? And so it has to be the responsibility of these many different groups to try to solve this problem and protect ourselves, protect our democracy.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professor Cailin O'Connor and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be on Wednesday, October 7th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Professors Tamara Vanit Shelton and Sarah Sarzinski will be moderating a panel on global movements to topple historical monuments. Thank you and have a good evening.